Opening up diagonals for the queen and bishop, this thrust immediately stakes a claim in the center. Opening the center symmetrically immediately sets up a struggle for central control and piece activity. Developing a knight to its most active square, this move immediately contests control of the center and prepares to castle, launching a preemptive strike on black's pawn. Developing a knight here defends the central pawn and prepares for queenside expansion, a sound classical response. Unveiling the Ruy-Lopez, white immediately pressures black's knight, hinting at future central control and potential tactical skirmishes. Challenging the bishop's placement, this pawn advance questions white's immediate pressure and prepares to gain space on the queen side. Preserving the pinned knight's influence and maintaining pressure along the long diagonal is the immediate strategic aim. Challenging white's aggressive bishop, this develops a knight while preparing to strike at the center, potentially opening lines for your own pieces. Securing the king initiates a phase of rapid development, aiming to activate pieces before black can consolidate their position. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing to develop the dark-squared bishop openly is the key idea here. Solidifying the center and preparing d4, this move elegantly aims for queenside expansion while keeping king safety paramount. Developing the bishop to a useful diagonal, this move prepares to castle and connects the rooks. Launching a central pawn thrust immediately challenges black's pieces and opens lines for white's attack. A bold repositioning, preparing for a fianchetto to bolster the kingside's defense and potentially pressure the center. Developing the knight to d2 prepares for a kingside expansion and avoids blocking the c-pawn. Developing the queen to e7 prepares for kingside castling, while simultaneously reinforcing the d6 pawn and potentially eyeing the h4 square. Bringing the rook to the center aims to prepare for potential central breakthroughs, eyeing open files and asserting pressure. Developing the bishop to its most natural long diagonal prepares for potential castling and reinforces the kingside structure. Repositioning the knight to f1 is a subtle maneuver, aiming to free the e-file for the rook and potentially reroute the knight to a more active square on the kingside, reinforcing the d-pawn's defense. Securing the monarch amidst the arising central conflict strengthens black's defensive pawn shield and prepares for a potential queenside expansion. Developing the bishop here forces a decision, potentially opening lines for an attack or clarifying the pawn's structure. Challenging the bishop's eye immediately addresses its forward pressure. Shifting the bishop away from the immediate pawn skirmish, white aims to redeploy it to a more commanding diagonal, possibly influencing the queenside or preparing for a central push. Relocating the queen to e8 clears the third rank for rook development and potentially prepares a kingside fianchetto or a queenside pawn storm. Retreating the bishop from the busy diagonal aims to consolidate white's queenside and prepare for a central pawn advance. Initiating a knight sortie towards the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pieces. Repositioning the knight to a more flexible square, ready to support a central pawn push or join the queenside attack. The knight's retreat to e7 opens lines for the queen and potentially prepares a kingside pawn push to challenge white's central control. Liberating the d-file opens attacking avenues, potentially targeting the weakened kingside. Reclaiming the central pawn opens lines and initiates counterplay for black's queenside. A strategic repositioning, the bishop retreats to a more passive square, potentially ceding central influence for defensive solidity. Trading knights immediately simplifies the position, potentially favoring white's more centralized pieces and open queen file. Opening the h-file creates a direct assault line towards black's monarch, potentially initiating a dangerous kingside attack. A direct challenge on the d-file, seeking to disrupt white's pawn structure and activate the rook into the center. Focusing the queen on the central files, white prepares to contest the open d-file and potentially support an advance of the kingside pawn structure. Unlocking the queen's rook file opens lines for the rook, while the knight seeks better squares away from the pawn chain. Unlocking the d-file aggressively seeks central influence and prepares potential breakthroughs against black's cramped position. This move aims to solidify black's queenside pawns and prepare for a potential b5 pawn advance, but it somewhat neglects the central tension and white's kingside initiative. Repositioning the rook to the second rank bolsters the pressure on the d-file and prepares for future central pawn advances. A surprising sidestep, the queen retreats again, perhaps seeking refuge from the looming central tension and preparing a potential maneuver. Reinforcing the d-file now, white builds pressure and eyes potential breakthroughs. Reasserting control over the queenside now, the knight embarks on a journey to contest the b-file and potentially raid white's queenside structure. Opening a queenside flank opens new avenues for the bishop and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure. Unleashing the bishop to its active diagonal, a bold statement of intent in this queenside dance, seeking to disrupt white's structural plans. Preparing to eye the queenside pawns, the bishop repositions to contest the a4-e8 diagonal and perhaps stir up some trouble there. Sacrificing the exchange for active piece play, aiming to dismantle white's pawn structure and exploit the open d-file. Recapturing the rook with the queen now challenges black's queen and aims to dominate the central files. Exchanging the bishop opens the h-file, creating attacking potential but also leaving black's king exposed. Opening that f-file offers a direct assault route for your rook. Shifting the queen to attack the d-pawn creates immediate pressure, eyeing a potential weakness. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure prevents black's knight from infiltrating and prepares for potential queenside expansion. Recapturing on b3 clears the way, but activating the bishop here allows white immediate central pressure. Injecting pawn pressure forward creates immediate space and challenges black's queenside structure. Reclaiming the knight's outpost offers a welcome respite from white's encroaching pawn wall, seeking freer squares. Sharpening the pressure on the queenside, this knight's sacrifice threatens to unravel black's pawn structure. A daring sortie for the queen, hoping to exploit the newly opened queenside lines, but it leaves the king's flank vulnerable to a swift white advance. Seizing the open file here gambles on regaining initiative and creating advanced pawn threats. Unleashing the bishop here looks to exploit the potentially weak dark squares around white's king. Unleashing a knight fork, this capture disrupts black's queenside pawns and creates immediate structural weaknesses for their king. Opening the h-file after exchanges grants potential counterplay, but compromises kingside pawn structure, inviting future pressure. Seizing the initiative, white snatches a pawn, creating immediate pressure and potential disruption on the queenside. Seeking counterplay, black repositions the knight to the queenside, aiming to activate it along the rank. Targeting the queenside pawn majority with the queen's renewed pressure. Activating the rook to potentially challenge the open file offers a dynamic counterplay. Disrupting black's passive queen placement, this threatens to unravel their position and offers a clear path to simplification. Shielding the king from the newly opened diagonal is paramount, but this retreat also sacrifices valuable central presence. Centralizing the queen exploits black's compromised pawn structure and prepares a swift advance into enemy territory. Capturing the pawn is a tempting, but ultimately dangerous, gamble that unravels black's position. Escalating the pawn storm opens lines for your queen and knight. Unlocking the f-file opens a direct assault route, forcing white to defend the exposed king. Capturing the pawn opens the queen to new attacking avenues, but sacrifices crucial central control for immediate material gain. Seeking counterplay, this queen maneuver aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially harass the king. Aggressively seizing the 7th rank now challenges black's king. Restoring pieces to the board signals a shift toward a more open, material-balanced struggle, where precise piece placement will be paramount. Unleashing a king hunt that forces a clear material advantage with no immediate retribution. Protecting the king is paramount, consolidating its position and preparing for future maneuvers. Unleashing a deadly discovered check, White aims to dislodge the black king from its precarious shelter. Seeking a safer haven, the black king abandons the exposed queenside for a potential shelter near the center, though this creates significant pawn weaknesses. Unleashing a knight fork targets the king and threatens immediate material gain. Accepting the knight sacrifice unravels black's defensive structure, opening crucial lines for white's immediate kingside assault. King hunt intensifies, forcing the rook to sacrifice its activity for tempo. Seeking refuge, the king attempts to escape the pervasive pressure building on the queenside. Securing the monarch's safety now becomes paramount after the exchange of queens, preparing for potential endgame skirmishes. Attempting to disrupt white's solid pawn structure and activate the rook, though it may invite further queenside pressure. Seizing control of the open file to attack the enemy king is paramount. Securing the monarch becomes paramount. Black's king now faces considerable danger on the open diagonals. A quiet repositioning to activate the queen for future decisive action. Seeking to untangle the rook's bind and activate the queen for counterplay on the queen's side. Forcing the black king out into the open, a decisive tactical maneuver. A strategic retreat to consolidate the king's safety, seeking refuge from white's aggressive queen. Securing the queenside pawn advance creates irresistible pressure.